Good evening. Welcome to KB Hurst and her Menagerie. This is going to be episode 1 of By the Call of Midnight, aka KB Hurst reads a book that she wrote when she was 16. So, just a little bit of background. I used to be very into reading Victoria Holt Gothic romance novels, and so this was inspired by all of those. And while this is extremely hilarious for me to go back and read this, I didn't even bother reading this ahead of time to get a feel for what it was I was going to be reading. This is fresh, just as it is for you, as it is for me. So, Chapter 1, The Journey Begins. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon when I graduated from my finishing school in Dijon, France. The sun was shining on my auburn hair, and the wind was blowing ferociously, so I was wearing my usual light green cloak over me. I was on my way back to the school with my friend, Clara. I had recently went to the post office, and I was in apprehension, for I had received a letter from my Aunt Lacey Yorkshire, who lived in London, England. She wrote to say that her health might not be holding up much longer, and wanted to know if her favorite grandniece would spend the holidays with her. I thought this was a wonderful idea. As much as I wanted to go back to Boston with my parents, who were here in Dijon, to see me graduate, I wanted to see my aunt, perhaps for the last time. I brought it up that evening to my parents, who were none too glad to let me go, for I had been very close to my aunt at one time, that is, before she moved away from us, and she left her home in Boston 5 years ago to move all the way back home to her birth home in London, England. My little Aubrey, of course you may go. We'll see you in January, am I right? Asked my father. Yes, I said. Oh, John Amos Yorkshire, how can you let her go? Asked my mother. What about the holidays? Ugh, she'll be fine, he said. And so I was on my way to London. Chapter 2. When I arrived in London by ferry, my Aunt Lacey was there waiting for me. She was shorter than I remembered. Her hair was whiter, and she moved slower than she used to. I could tell under the large hat and parasol that she was very happy to see me. She had her driver Dawson pick her up her things, and on our way we went. When we reached the city crowd, she put her hand through mine. All the racket made her nervous. My father told me she never goes in the city alone if she can help it. We passed all of the town houses, and we neared the countryside. We were driving an hour before I realized we were no longer in London. Auntie? Yes, Audrey. Where are we going? I asked. I forgot to tell you, obviously, she said, putting her palm to her face. Tell me what? I asked. That I was going to spend my holidays in the country, she proclaimed, quite happy with herself. Well, I've never seen this side of England. I hear it's quite lovely, I said, trying to hide my frustration and my anger. I was hoping to spend the holidays in London. I hadn't been there since I was a child. I remember London Bridge and Big Ben. Now I was going to some remote countryside. What adventures could I have here? We passed a lovely brick mansion that looked more like a castle. Whose is that? I asked. That is where an old friend of mine lived when I was growing up here. He still lives there. One thing I remembered about my aunt is she was never a precise person. She was always that person that left out details whenever she told me something. What is his name? I persisted on knowing. Whose? She asked. The man you were talking about that lived in the mansion we passed. Oh, His name is Henry Belhurst. His wife passed on recently. It's told that the Midnight Man caught her and enchanted her, she said mysteriously. Who's that? I asked. Well, some say he's a ghost, others say he's a werewolf. Such nonsense, I laughed. Better not mention that. People here still believe in those old legends. Well, what does the Midnight Man do to his victims? I asked. He's supposed to be so handsome that when you see him, you can't stop staring at him. You'll freeze, and then in an instant, he changes his form and gobbles you up. And if he doesn't want you or thinks you are unpleasing to him, he feeds you to his wolves. Well, I hope I never meet the Midnight Man, I said, shivering. I looked out the window at the carriage. There's still a full moon shining through the trees. How mastic and magic it seemed. We turned down a long drive at which there was a gate and a metal-pointed fence all around it. Ha! We're here! Her house was grand indeed. It was filled with brick stones and was larger than any home I had ever seen. How on earth did you come across this place? I asked my aunt. Well, this was my mother and father's home. They left it to me when they died. Don't you just love it? I really do love it. I miss it whenever I'm away. Yes, I can see why, I said as we opened the parlor door. It was all green and gold inside with marble floors and a fireplace to match. The curtains were velvet and the seats were made of pure silk. Never in my wildest imagination could I have imagined it. The dining room had an 18-seat table that stretched from one end to the other. She had a shiny wooden oak floor under it with a carpet in blue and cream, like the room, made from India. She led me up to my bedroom, which was the grandest in the house. It contained a large bed made of oak, as well as the dresser and vanity. All the curtains and beds and blankets and settee cushions were of gold color. She shut the door then and hollered for me to feel at home. She could tell from my expression that I was afraid to touch anything. Later that night, I went to sleep and slept like a baby. When I awoke, dressed, and did my hair, I went down to breakfast. The table was so long we had hardly said a word, for it was hard to hear anything. Soon after, both of us retired to the library, where she took out a letter and gave it to me to read. All it said was, "Dear Lacey," and asked if she and her niece would come to have dinner with a Mr. Belhurst. Yes, and? I asked my aunt. Would you like to visit Mr. Belhurst? She asked. Well, yes, that would be lovely. I'll write him and tell him that you'll be happy to go, she said. I looked up at my aunt. Don't you mean us? I asked. Now, dear, you know how hard it is for some of my age to get around. You may go alone. Mr. Belhurst's son will pick you up on the Narrow, and off you'll go to dinner. You must be ready by 6, so we'll go into London and find you something suitable to wear, if you like. Couldn't I just wear one of my own? I only have $100. Well, I'll pay. I just thought you might want to buy something new. I was young once, too. I could tell she only wanted to impress Mr. Belhurst, so I agreed. Chapter 3. It was raining when Mr. Belhurst's son arrived. He was tall and had light brown hair with misty blue eyes. He was built and had a thin yet attractively set bony face. He looked like a duke, for he passed himself off as though he were of royalty. He came up to my door with an umbrella. I already had one, yet he insisted on his helping me anyway. My aunt watched from the window. Her face was mocking, and I knew instantly why she had made me go. She wanted me to find a friend in Mr. Belhurst's son, and there was no need for her to chaperone, for Mr. Belhurst himself would be there. As we drove along, I said nothing. It was Mr. Belhurst's son, Andrew, who finally said something besides our how-do-you-dos. Well, my brother from France will be with us today. He's sort of a squire, he said, smiling. Really? I asked, interested. Yes, he lives in France during the summer, and comes back in the fall. He's rather peculiar, he said. What makes him peculiar? I asked. He has 3 pet wolves, he said, laughing a little. Oh, yes, I can see it as rather peculiar. But I've always thought that if someone was a little different in his or her ways, that it was a good thing, because they weren't following someone else's example, I said. I see. Are you one of those people you just described? He asked. Well, in a way, I said. He then looked down at me, very keenly observed me. I felt rather uncomfortable under his gaze. I decided to say something to provoke his eyes away from me. So, what do you do for a living? I asked him. He was staring down at my necklace, which was a cameo of white lace. I picked it out specifically for the occasion. I wore it with the pink velvet dress my aunt had bought me the day before. I'm a lawyer by trade, Miss Yorkshire, he said, finally tearing his eyes away from my neck. That must keep you very busy, I said. Very. We are here now, he said, pulling into the Belhurst Drive. The house was grand on the outside, a lot like my aunt's, yet on the inside it was very dull. Andrew led me into a room where a young woman was standing, which I suspected was someone's wife. She was rather tall, yet petite. She was knitting little blue and pink socks, and I didn't know why until she stood up. Her hair was full of gold ringlets, and she tucked one behind her ear and reached out to shake my hand. My husband's rather rude. Aren't you, Andrew? I'm Georgiana Fontaine Belhurst, Andrew's wife. Oh, congratulations. I see you're about to have a little one, I said, finally seeing how large her stomach was. I'm sorry, I completely forgot to mention you, dear. One doesn't spill out his whole life on first acquaintance, he said. He looked at me mockingly, and with that rueful glaze, he made me think of demons. Yet there was this look about him that showed clear devotion to his wife. The two then led me around the house until we came to the sitting room, where the 2 servants were carrying in cakes and hot tea. I saw there were 2 men in there. One was standing up and walking towards us. The other sat with his back to us. Hello, I'm charmed to meet you. Your aunt has written me about you, and even spoke on many occasions about how beautiful you are, yet I never realized that she was the only speaking half the truth, for you are the loveliest woman in all this side of the country. My aunt does like to dote on me, way too much. You must be Henry Belhurst. Yes, I am. I had been clearly wrong about my aunt's intentions of sending me there. She simply wanted me to have friends here after all. Will you meet my other son, Michael? Come this way. He led me back into the sitting room. I was completely taken aback when his son stood and turned my way. It was as though I were frozen in time, for there before me was the most handsome man I had ever seen. He had rather long hair, just reaching an inch or 2 above his shoulders. It was thick and wavy. His eyes were piercing blue as they stared into mine. I felt he was looking directly into my soul. He walked slowly over to me and took my hand and bent down and kissed it. You are Miss Lacey Yorkshire's niece? He said, with more of a statement rather than a question. Yes, I am. He was still staring into me. It was, however, a gaze that enchanted me. I could see why his brother brought him a peculiar and a rather mysterious, foreboding atmosphere, almost spying. Will you be accompanying me to dinner? You may sit next to me, he said, putting his arm through mine. We sat down and were served soup as a start. Then we were served turkey and pork beans and wine. The bread was thick and filling. It was quite stuffed when we were all through. After dinner we had coffee, cake, along with coffee and cream, as well as tea. I got to know Mr. Henry Belhurst, and he insisted that I call him Henry. Andrew was the livelier of the 2 sons, and I noticed he wasn't quite as strange as I first thought he was. Later, Michael asked me if I wanted to take a walk with him so he could show me the gardens. They had burst into full bloom, which would soon perish when winter came. It was a beautiful world of flowers I had come across with Michael by my side. Perhaps it was him that made me feel as though I could never leave. I wanted to stay by his side, yet I had only just met him. We've only just met, yet I can feel as though I've known you for years. I want to keep knowing you, Miss Yorkshire, he said, taking my hand up to his chest. Please, call me Audrey. Yes, I know what you mean. I feel it too, I said, looking into those eyes that saw my soul. He suddenly leaned deeper into my face, and without even a hint of urging, he kissed my lips. I was lost for words for a few seconds. I knew at that moment I'd never be the same. How could I? Here was the man of my dreams. I thought coming here would not be quite as interesting as London, yet I was being kissed by a handsome gentleman. I was surely in love, and I'd never forget this moment. Over the next few weeks, I took walks with him and shared our little moments here and there, and we were completely devoted to one another. Or so I thought. Georgiana came to see me one afternoon. We had become quite good friends over the last few weeks. She walked into my aunt's sitting room, and as I served her tea and chocolate cake, she then told me she had very urgent news to tell me. I was absolutely surprised when I awoke this morning to find Andrew drinking coffee and just sitting there as Michael drove off in the carriage with no explanation as to where he was going. I asked Andrew where he was going, and Andrew said he figured back to France. He said, "You know how his moods are." I'm so very sorry, Audrey. I asked what this could possibly mean for you, yet Andrew had no answers. I know how well you two have been getting along, she said in dismay. Well, what did Andrew mean by his moods? Oh, sometimes Andrew said Michael gets severely upset about what I have no idea. Andrew told me that once he found him awake out of his sleep to find Michael throwing things around. Andrew said he was crashing as though having a temper tantrum. He said that he had asked Michael to stop, and Michael just turned to stare at him, his wild blue eyes just piercing straight through him as though he were mad, she said. I thanked her for telling me, and then she left. I could not figure out this man. Was he a monster or a ravishing hero? I somehow felt betrayed. I thought we had meant something to one another. And that concludes the first section for tonight's story. I may be able to narrate more this week as I am off for the week. We will continue soon with part 2, The Monster.